Gracious God, grant us always to seek the truth, come whence it may, cost what it will. Amen.
Amen.
You know, like the parable of the prodigal son, the parable we heard this morning about the laborers in the vineyard often evokes some pretty strong responses from its modern day readers. Because like that loyal, hard-working son in the prodigal parable who didn't run off and squander his inheritance, many of us can also relate to the workers in the story today, their disbelief after spending an entire day toiling in the vineyard and only to get paid last and get paid no more than the guys who had only worked for an hour. And this, Jesus says, is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Really? Okay. Taken at face value, this doesn't sound like such a great deal. But remember, this is a parable. And parables are intended to turn things on their head. So in this story today, Jesus tells us that this landowner, he goes to the marketplace first thing in the morning to hire people to work in his vineyard. And he offers them the standard daily wage. And then he goes back out and he hires more people at 9 o'clock and at noon and at 3 o'clock and even at 5 o'clock. And he tells each of these that he will give them whatever is right. So then when the workday comes to an end, he first pays the folks who had worked only an hour, and he gives them a full day's wage. When those who had worked all day get to the front of the line, they're paid the same amount, which is exactly what he promised them. He promised them a full day's wage. So he has not done them wrong, and he hasn't shorted them in order to pay the others. But it isn't fair. It isn't fair, they complain. How is it that we can work all day and get no more than those who work for an hour or two? To our 21st century American capitalist sensibilities, that does seem out of line. And who are these people who at the end of the day, they're still standing around at 5 o'clock? Why have they not gotten work by now? Well, it's important to think about all of these folks that got hired this day. All of the people for the landowner, they were all day laborers. All of them, from the ones who were hired at dawn to the ones who got hired at the end of the day, they were all day laborers. They were people who didn't own their own land, and they didn't have jobs or trades that kept them fully employed. So they went each day to the market, hoping to pick up some work. They were poor. But again, why at the end of the day? Why are there still some at the end of the day at 5 o'clock? Who are they? What is that group? Now, there's nothing in the text that suggests that they were lazy or that they were latecomers. When the landowner asks them, why are you still here? They say, well, because nobody hired us. They were probably folks that we might call hard to employ. Maybe they had a disability. Maybe they were older than all the workers that were hired before them. Maybe they were small and didn't look like they might be strong enough to do the work. They were perhaps the poorest of the poor, the outcasts in this community. And yet the landowner hires them anyway. And the landowner treats them with dignity. He sees them and he pays them whatever is right, he says, just as he promised. And that turns out to be a full day's wage. And what we see in the actions of the landowner, we see what Jesus says is the kingdom of heaven. He says, this is what it looks like. It looks like God's extravagant grace made manifest in this landowner's acts of generosity and equity and dignity and justice. You know, I think our first instinct often is like the workers who had worked all day. While we might not necessarily begrudge the last folks from getting some sort of pay, it's hard to accept that they should get paid as much as we do, that they should be made equal with us. And think about this. Think about some ways this plays out in our own lives. Perhaps we look at someone standing on a corner asking for money, and we think, that guy looks pretty young, pretty healthy. He should go get a job instead of standing out here asking me for money. And yet the irony is that if he walked into our place of business from that street corner looking for a job, we'd likely turn him away without even a conversation. Perhaps never hearing his story, that he has a college degree and he used to have a great job for one of the auto suppliers until they downsized and he got laid off and he lost his job and he lost his house and he lost his marriage. We just see him as the homeless guy who needs to earn his way back into society's good graces. Or think about before COVID struck and we would accept food donations here at the church for the Open Hands Food Pantry. And we would often get calls from people saying, hey, I cleaned out my cupboards and I have a whole bunch of canned goods and boxed goods. Can I bring them in? And we'd say, sure, but we just need to make sure to tell you that they can't be expired. None of the food can be expired. And honestly, there were people who would say, well, but aren't you giving it to people for free? If it's for free, what does it matter? Like somehow people who need our help don't deserve the same quality of food that we would put on our own tables for our own family, right? Not begrudging them the food, but not honoring them the same that we would give our families. God's extravagant grace, as it was shown by this landowner, is revealed in the world through our actions and attitudes, just like that landowner. We are God's hands and feet, co-creating with God, God's kingdom of heaven on earth. And it doesn't look like judgment. And it doesn't look like some kind of social hierarchy of who deserves what. It calls us to see ourselves in one another like God sees us. And God doesn't have separate values. Certain values for those who work a full day and different values for folks who only work a couple hours or don't work at all. God doesn't value me any more than God values anybody else. We do that. That's what our human instincts sometimes lead us to, and certainly it's what our culture teaches us. That some are better or more worthy than others. And we assign that value by things like somebody's wealth, or their education, or their zip code, or their race, or their gender, or their sexual orientation. God doesn't do that. When I think about what this extravagant, abundant grace is that we witness in this parable, that what Jesus is trying to teach us about, what God's extravagant grace looks like justice. And it's ours to participate and to bring about. Like, to me, it looks like when the kid in Highland Park gets to go to a school that's just as resourced as a kid in Birmingham or Bloomfield. That is a way we are expressing God's grace in the world. That's what it looks like. When the essential workers who have kept us fed and cared for during this pandemic, when they're paid a living wage and they're given the same access to health care as the CEO and the CFO who run their companies, that's an expression of God's grace in the world. When the lives of people of color matter as much as the lives of white people, that is an expression of God's grace in the world. When a woman or a child says, "Me too," and we say, "I believe you," That is an expression of God's extravagant grace. When folks in the LGBT community, like me, don't have to worry about whether we're allowed to be married or whether we could get fired from a job, that's an expression of God's grace in the world. And this is the kind of extravagant grace we are called to bear witness to in this world. And friends, our country, our world needs us right now. Needs this kind of extravagant grace. Needs us to stand up for what is right and what is good and what is holy. You know, not only have we had this pandemic to deal with, but we have lost two giants, two models of this kind of grace as justice in the world. Congressman John Lewis and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But while they are gone, the ideals they fought for are not. They have left them with us to carry and to move forward. I was thinking about that as I was thinking about this parable, and I was listening to a podcast. And the podcast it's about speeches. It's by John Meacham, and it's called It Was Said. And there's a number of speeches that he looks at in their historical context, and one of them was the eulogy given by President Obama at the funeral for the 9 people who were murdered by a white supremacist at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in 2015. And in that eulogy, the president talked about God's grace. And he said that while we have been lost, we are given the chance to find our best selves through the extravagant grace of God offered to all of us. He said that while we have certainly not earned this grace with our rancor and complacency and short-sightedness and fear of each other, we got it all the same. God gave it to us anyway, and it's up to us to make the most of it. So friends, let's go into the world today with a new resolve. A resolve to shower God's extravagant grace like the landowner did in this parable. The grace that has been showered upon us and is showered upon all. Let's be so transformed by our understanding of God's extravagant grace that we offer our full selves to carry on the work of justice that has been set before us. Let's throw grace around like confetti, like glitter, and leave in our wake a ground covered in nothing but justice. Amen.